Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hare Hare, Hare Rama, Rama Rama, Hare Hare, Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hare Hare, Hare Rama, Rama, Rama Rama, Hare Hare, Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hare Hare, Hare Rama, Rama Rama, Hare Hare, Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hare Hare, Hare Rama, Rama Rama, Hare Hare, Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hare Hare, Hare Rama, Rama Rama, Hare Hare, Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hare Hare, Hare Ram, Rama Ram, Hare Hare, Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hare Hare, Hare Ram, Ram Rama, Hare Hare, Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hare Hare, Hare Ram, Rama Ram, Hare Hare, Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hare Hare, Hare Ram, Rama Ram, Hare Hare, Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hare Hare, Hare Ram, Rama Ram, Hare Hare, Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hare Hare, Hare Ram, Ram, Hare Hare. Shri Radha Govinda Deva Ki Jai. Kali Yuga Dharma Shri Harinam Sankirtan Ki Jai. Welcome. Welcome back, welcome again to another session where we get to go on divine adventures of the supreme kind. And we get to find out what our Supreme Personalities will do next. This is day 7 of our Navratri celebrations. And today we celebrate the goddess Kalaratri, or MahaKali. The names have become interchangeable over time. And today we are going to find out what miraculous thing the goddess will do next. We have been going on a journey of inner transformation, of finding out many hidden facts, finding out the innermost realizations that this goddess can bring forth throughout our lives. And we've been taking shelter of her as we go. And I'm so glad that we get to join together once again in the company of like-minded spiritual seekers, I hope, fingers crossed. And we get to find out more about the goddess MahaKali. Tonight is one of my favorite nights. It is going to be a very fierce night. It is going to be a night of heroism. It is going to be a night of finding beauty in the darkness. So I hope that we are all ready for this wonderful journey, this great adventure into somewhat of the unknown, and I'm excited to be here with you, ready to read, ready to have realizations, ready to express our vulnerabilities on this path of devotion and on this path of bhakti. So without further ado, we will draw our minds to the realm of bliss and the playground of prema, that playground of divine love, Sri Vrindavan Dham. And we'll do so with the bhajan Jai Radha Madhava. Jai Radha Madhava Kunja Bihari Gopi Jannavalabha Girivaradhari Jai Radha Madhava Kunja Bihari Gopi Jannavalabha Girivaradhari Jashodanandana Brajujana Ranjana Jamuna Tiravana Chari Jai Radha Madhava Kunja Bihari Gopi Jannavalabha Girivaradhari Jai Radha Madhava Jai Radha Madhava Radhe Govinda Jaya Radhe Govinda Shri Shri Radha Govinda Deva Ki Jai Shri Shri Radha Madhava Ki Jai Shri Vrindavan Dham Ki Jai Srila Prabhupada Ki Jai. So we are here, day 7, before our final 2 days of this 9-day festival. Like I said before, it gets bittersweet from here. Bitter because we don't want to leave these kathas every day, but sweet still because everything is sweet in this land of divine pastimes where the Supreme Personalities can do anything and everything. They make the impossible a notion of the imagination. So we are here to celebrate the goddess Kalaratri, MahaKali, the goddess of, you guessed it, auspiciousness. I'm sure you probably were not thinking auspiciousness when you first thought of MahaKali. Perhaps because of her fierce countenance, perhaps because of the many weapons that she holds, perhaps because of the skirt that she wears made of human arms, perhaps maybe because of the garland that she wears made of skulls and heads, perhaps because of the blood that is apparent on her form. She's decorated by the blood of the enemies that face her on the battlefield. So maybe you were not thinking that she is the goddess that governs auspiciousness. But she is. Auspiciousness and courage. We can seek to find both of those in her shelter. And tonight we get to find out why. What is it in this dark goddess, who I happen to like very much? What is it inherent in this dark goddess that brings auspiciousness from transformation, that brings help, shelter, and love from the darkest corners of existence? This is a night of revelation. This is a night where we are going to explore some really deep, wonderful occurrences as we tell the story of MahaKali from the way that I have been able to gather this narrative from many different places and from different Puranas. you're going to notice that there is some strong ideas. There's some strong language that I have actually dimmed for presenting it to a wider audience. The demigods and the demons are going to be engaged in battle. As we have seen throughout many nights, as we have seen throughout months and months of our journeys through these pastimes, it seems like the demigods and the demons are always warring. There's always this war between divine and demoniac tendencies. I've heard in previous yugas and in previous ages, my friends and my own mentors that I consider on this spiritual path, they have said in previous yugas they lived in different realms. Then so in Satya Yuga sometimes they lived in different realms. Treta Yuga they lived in different planets, but on the same realm. In Dwapar Yuga they lived on the same planet, sometimes within the same family. And in Kali Yuga, sometimes these divine and demoniac tendencies and natures live within the same body. So within the same self. So we can look at how the great goddess can root out these demoniac tendencies within the heart. Those things that do not serve us on the path of spirituality. The deepest, darkest parts of ourselves that even we are sometimes afraid to face. And why? Why is that fear there? Sometimes the fear is there because it gives us an innate sense of when to pull back. Sometimes fear can tell us when it is not safe to continue. Fear can tell us, wait, have patience, hold back. But sometimes fear tells us, you'll never amount to anything. Sometimes fear tells us, stop, don't go forward, you're just a failure. And so this wonderful goddess, which I love the fact that Sri Krishna's own shadow, Sri Krishna's own internal potency is not just one thing. She is not just one aspect. We've covered so many aspects of this divine internal potency of my Supreme Lord Sri Krishna over these past few days. She is not simply merciful, not just compassionate, not just beautiful and wonderful, but sometimes she is also fierce. Sometimes she is also untamed and wild. Sometimes she is also the darkness that roots out all of that unwanted dirt from the heart, so that that most auspicious light can enter, so that the light of devotion can fill up our hearts and our paths and our very lives. So I love that a goddess that we have seen as a mother, a goddess that we have seen as a divine guide and mentor, a spiritual guiding force on our path, now tonight will be seen in a very, very different way. So there is very strong language in this pastime that, like I said, I have kind of pared down for a wide audience. So know for sure that when you hear things that make your insides kind of tie up in knots, that make you feel like, oh, that's not right, it was stronger in the Puranas when I read it. And it is for this reason that I kind of love this pastime, this adventure that we're about to go on, because this goddess is not meant to be tamed. Not by anyone. Not unless she herself decides that she is willing to come under the protection and shelter of another. She is a force unto herself. She is not just possessed of power, she is power. And it's kind of glorious and wonderful and beautiful to witness. It's like witnessing a thunderstorm. All of that power of the lightning and the thunder that makes the hairs on your arm rise up. You can feel the static electricity. You can feel the thunder in your chest. It makes you realize just how small we are as infinitesimal living entities. And yet you know for sure that that terrific, awesome power is not there to hurt you. So, sometimes that fear tells us, no, you'll never be anything. You'll never amount to anything. That is the fear that we want to root out. That fear that does not serve us along the spiritual path. That is the tendency toward control. That tendency toward egoism. That tendency toward the darkest regions of human functioning and psychology. That's what we want to root out. Because it is that fear that tells us that we are limited. Those self-limiting fears that tell us that we are far away from our connection with our divine supreme person. That is what leads to saying, only I can succeed. That is the fear and the thought process that leads us towards saying, I can't give respect to all others because if I do that, what will be left for me? I must hoard power. I must hoard possessions. I must hoard prestige. In order for me to succeed, I have to cut out everyone else. Those are the tendencies that we want to root out. Those are the tendencies that we want to do away with. Those are the tendencies that we want to pray to this goddess of auspiciousness to root out within our hearts, to do away with, mercifully cut away in the most gentle and beautiful way possible. So we'll see those characteristics come up within this pastime. The pastime of possessing that which is not ours to possess. The characteristics of controlling others. The characteristic of this dog-eat-dog world of competition, which breeds this envy and greed. So this is what we will see. Those are the tendencies within the demons. And then the goddess comes in like a burst of, I want to say, effulgent light. However, she is dark like midnight. So she comes in like a burst of effulgent power and Shakti, because there is no other word to describe it. She comes in and she arrives and she is able to bring about a new way of thinking, a transformation in this new world order, where devotion is now praised above all else. She is a protector of love and devotion. She is a protector of bhakti. She is a protector of the heart. And all of those things which help us reclaim and regain our relationship with our Supreme Person. So where fear tells us, no, absolutely, you will not amount to anything, this goddess tells us we were always ready. We were always possessing of that power and that will and that drive. This goddess brings in the auspiciousness that tells us you are never far away from Krishna. Don't let anyone ever tell you differently. Where our fears tell us, no, you cannot, this goddess says, you better. Not just you can, but you better. Rise to the occasion. Rise to the challenge. Embrace that spirituality and find the beauty hidden in the darkest regions of the heart. Because once we do that, we can find a way to allow the sun to rise. We can find a way for a new dawn to arrive. But until we face those things, till we face those tendencies and root out those characteristics and get that fear out of the way, we will consider it a stumbling block. So let us fasten our seatbelts. Let us utter our mystic incantation and our mantra, which will allow us to run to this most divine realm, where these pastimes are still being enacted because they are eternal. And let us get our hearts ready for a transformation of the best kind. Om Namo Bhagavate Vasudevaya. Om Namo Bhagavate Vasudevaya. Om Namo Bhagavate Vasudevaya. Yesterday we heard of the defeat of Mahishasur. We heard of the way in which the beautiful goddess Katyayani defeated this Asura, pounding him under her feet, plunging her trident into him, beheading him with her sword. She was heroic and terrific, just like her brother, Lord Vishnu. And we heard of how the realm celebrated her with songs and prayers, and she blessed them with her guidance and her compassionate glance. Now, the demons are confused. The demons are now trying to find their footing once again. So we'll dive into this story, and I hope that you enjoy this dramatic narrative that I have tried to bring to you. This pastime, this wonderful, glorious adventure of Kalaratri. She was viciously beautiful. Her figure was captivating, and she radiated a savagery like I have never seen before. She moved through the battlefield like a ghostly apparition before she slew the great Mahishasur. If you two help me, then I'll make that rare and deadly gem my wife. Raktabija, the fallen Mahishasur's prime minister, sat in the court of Shumba and Nishumba, the two demon brothers who had taken over all corners of the universe after the demise of Mahishasur. You talk like a lovesick youth. You can't possibly hope to possess a wife like that. Only someone with Shumba's prowess can hope to win that powerful goddess. Chanda chuckled derisively, while Raktabija cast an irritated glance in his direction. Chanda and Munda had both been ministers to Mahishasur, but Raktabija curled his lip in disgust at their hastily shifted loyalty. Fate was indeed a fickle mistress, and it seemed as though the Chanda and Munda would follow whomever she favored at any given moment. It didn't take long for word of Mahishasur's death to spread throughout the realms, and when Shumba and Nishumba heard that the great demon was killed by a woman, they were intrigued at the very thought of this new warrior. They had sent a messenger to propose marriage with the goddess, and it wasn't long before he returned from the Vindhya mountains. Shumba called him in and awaited his message, but Sugriva, the messenger, remained quiet, his eyes darting around the room warily. Now we've heard of another Sugriva, the monkey warrior in Sri Ram's army, but this is the demon messenger. Same name, different person. I presented your message to the goddess, Sugriva stammered, and shifted his weight from one foot to another. And Shumba was not a man who was known for his patience, and he was eager to know what his bride thought of their alliance. She laughed, my lord. A hushed silence fell over the assembly hall, and the guard took a guarded step back from the demon king before he continued hurriedly. She said that she has taken a vow only to marry the person who can defeat her in battle. The goddess seemed as though there was nothing that would sway her determination. Shumba motioned for the messenger to be gone, and Sugriva sighed, relieved as he moved from the center of the hall. So we heard yesterday that the goddess Katyayani was also proposed marriage by Mahishasur, and she said, I will vow to only marry he who can defeat me on the battlefield. So once again, this goddess has sent her message again. Goddess. Shumba barked out a sharp laugh while he spat the word. Behind that goddess lies a woman, and deep within every woman is the desire to be claimed. This arrogant goddess thinks that she can order me. Luckily, I am an expert in curbing the harsh feminine temper. Dhumraksha! Shumba called for one of his guards, who came forward and stood awaiting his orders. Go to Vindhyachala and bring that proud goddess here. Shumba's lascivious smile was dripping with ill intent. And if she will not come willingly, my lord, Dhumraksha was just as ruthless as his master, and it showed in his eyes that glowed at the prospect of capturing a goddess. Grab her by the hair and drag her here if you must. Kill anyone who stands in your way. Shumba gave the order, and Dhumraksha bowed deeply, his glee evident as he turned and started out on his mission. As Dhumraksha stood in front of the goddess, he took a moment to appreciate that the tales of her beauty had not been exaggerated. Her form was pure art, and her eyes held a fire that Dhumraksha wanted to see tamed by his master. Come with me and see your master Shumba. Accept him as your husband. If you refuse to come willingly, it would be my greatest pleasure to take you there by force. Grabbing that lovely hair of yours, I would take great joy in dragging you to my master and watching him subdue all the pride you have shown thus far. The goddess Durga, who had also come to be known as Kaushiki, merely raised her eyebrows. Is that so? Her voice was soothing and deep, reaching out to parts of Dhumraksha's soul that called to him to see if he was strong enough to temper her. Well, if these are your orders, then what can a mere woman like me do? Challenges are meant to be enacted, not simply spoken. Come then, and do what you must. Her eyes beckoned to him, even while no part of her moved. Dhumraksha made a move toward the goddess, who remained seated on her throne. His entire army was behind him, and it seemed as though she didn't even have proper guardians. This was almost too easy. He took 2 steps at a run before he heard it. The sound was piercing, sharp, intense, and crushing. Dhumraksha looked around him, his confusion taking over as he wondered what in creation was making that awful wailing scream. His soldiers stooped under the force of the sound that rocked the Vindhya mountains to their core and shook the entire assembly hall. His soldiers were falling, one by one, and Dhumraksha was powerless to stop it. He could do nothing but cover his ears and hope that the sound would cease. His hopes were dashed as the terrible screeching continued. On and on it went, so loud that the sound even felt hot. What was this magnificent power? The last thing Dhumraksha saw was the face of the goddess, angry and terrible, her mouth open as that unearthly sound erupted from her, before he and his entire army were reduced to nothing more than a vast pile of ash. The goddess sat alone in her assembly hall once again, the sound of her one terrifying scream echoing throughout the peaks of the Vindhya hills, with the essence of death clinging to the pillars of her palace. It is said that the goddess uttered one scream, and with that one scream, she killed Dhumraksha and his entire army of demon soldiers. Shumba heard the terrifying noise. Everyone had heard it. It was impossible not to hear it. Roaring with rage, Shumba sent Chanda, Munda, the demon Ruru, and yet another vast army to attack the goddess. As the army converged on the goddess's palace, she mounted her lion and was followed by her associates and guards. Dhumraksha had foolishly thought that she was unprotected. Now the other demons would realize that he was terribly, horribly mistaken. Following her like a deadly shadow were the goddess's personal army. Howling ghosts formed, a moving cloud that attacked the demon soldiers and massacred them, looking like a great dust cloud of death. Chanda and Munda rushed at the goddess, thinking her to be occupied with the nearly unlimited ranks of their army. But she turned toward them and frowned. A small action, really. Her brows knitted close together and her eyes blazed briefly. But from that one small movement, there was a great flash of light, a light that was not light, and a being emerged from the goddess. She shook with anger. Her body was the color of the midnight sky. It was darker than black, and her eyes were fiercely wide open. There was a necklace of skulls around her neck, which clattered as she shook. A scimitar glinted and gleamed in her hands as though it was thirsty for blood. Blood. Her body was smeared with it. Where had she come from, and what was she going to do? The Black Knight! The demon soldiers began to scream as they scattered backwards like frightened insects from the woman who was laughing. The deep, ghastly sound wrenched from deep within her. She took halting, disjointed steps toward them, and the soldiers' screams began to mount. Kalaratri! Kali! They screamed until they were hoarse. Her name was the last thing to cross their lips before she massacred them. Her long hair scattering in the wind as she whipped through the battlefield, the clashing of metal against sword nearly drowned out by the tormented cries of the soldiers who lost their lives at her feet. The foolish demon Ruru rushed toward the goddess Kali, still failing to realize that there was no defeating this goddess of death. Kali Devi laughed as she raised her club and struck the demon with one fierce blow, relishing the sound of the crunch that accompanied the fall of his body as he crumbled to the battlefield. She was not yet finished. This demon thought to harm her, to force her to submit. His body would become a fitting decoration for her. Raising her sword and cackling into the darkened sky, she skinned the demon carefully, wrapping up her wild mane with his hide. One strand of her matted, blood-soaked hair remained untied. The goddess plucked that hair out and dashed it upon the ground. A fierce woman arose from that hair. Half her body was bright and effulgent, while the other half was black like that of Kali's. Her hair was soaked with oil, and her eyes blazed from the sockets of her gaunt, drawn face. In a voice like thunder, Kali commanded her, "Go, my sister, bring me those foolish demons Chanda and Munda." The two goddesses smiled at each other, their mouths fearsome mirrors of one another. The goddess Chandamari chased down the two demons who rightfully fled in fear of her. They were no match for the goddess who caught them by force and dragged them back to the goddess Kaushiki. With an angry slash, the goddess beheaded the two demons Chanda and Munda, who had given her much trouble, and she sent them to the abode of death to join their old master, Mahishasur. When Shumba learned that Chanda and Munda had been slain, he sent Raktabija to attack the goddess. When the goddess Durga, Chandamari, and Kali saw the approaching demon army, they began to roar. From that roaring came innumerable goddesses and witches who all began to roar along with their mistresses. Hearing the frightful sound of their collective roaring, which pierced all corners of creation, Lord Shiva appeared on the spot, his eyes intense and his very essence pulled by that of Adi Shakti's. He spoke to her. "What can I do to assist you? Order me." "O Shankar, deliver a message of mine. Tell those two demons, Shumba and Nishumba, that if they wish to continue living, they should abandon this realm and head to the lower planets. They should return Indra's domain to him. If they still wish to fight, then tell them to proceed to the battlefield, which will serve as their burial ground." The goddess Kaushiki's words were harsh, but her glance was deep and mysterious as she glanced at Lord Shiva. He inclined his head and left her palace at once. And because the goddess had made Lord Shiva her own messenger, she was hailed as Shiva Duti. When the ignorant demons heard the goddess's message, they journeyed quickly to the Vindhya mountains with every last soldier within their army. So we see that there is a great battle of charging and retreating. So they journeyed quickly to the Vindhya mountains with every last soldier within their army. The demons and their army showered weapons upon the goddesses, but their attempts were ineffectual, and soon hundreds of demons lay dead upon the battlefield. The ghost followers of the dark goddess began to devour the flesh of the fallen warriors, and the others who saw this began to flee, and ultimately took shelter of Raktabija. Raktabija finally entered the battlefield, driving away all of the ghostly followers of the goddess. The goddess Durga smiled at the other goddesses as they showered their weapons upon Raktabija. The demon general laughed wickedly as drops of his blood touched the ground, and clones of the demon Raktabija, equally matched in strength and prowess, rose up from each drop. Quickly, my sister, open your mouth and drink all of the blood of the demon before it can fall to the earth." The goddess ordered Kali Devi, who gladly obliged, opening her mouth wide and cupping her hands so that not a drop of blood spilled onto the earth as it flowed into her open, gaping mouth. In this way, the goddess made quick work of dispatching the demon Raktabija. Shumba advanced toward the goddess Durga, who turned to face him. Seeing her fierce countenance, he was stunned and stood in the midst of the battle still as a statue. The goddess smiled eerily and said, "You were boasting that you would obtain me as your wife, but here you stand lifeless. Is this the same prowess with which you defeated the demigods? Is this how you propose to conquer me and make me yours?" Her words were swimming in sarcasm. Shumba breathed heavily, his agitation growing with each insult she flung at him. "Silly woman, your delicate body will soon break into 100 pieces if I throw my weapons at you. It would be a shame to destroy such a work of beauty. Before I fight with you and destroy such an enchanting form, I suggest you think once more on my proposal and agree to be my wife." The demon's lust made him foolish and arrogant. Unfazed, the goddess simply smiled again. "But you and I both know that I will not accept a husband until I have been defeated on the battlefield. If you desire to possess me, then fight with me first. Prove that you can make me yours." Shumba, instigated by the words of the goddess, with a battle cry launched into battle with her. He raised his sword against her, but with 6 arrows she broke the demon's weapon to pieces. Shumba raised his club against her, but the great goddess raised her sword and like a flash of lightning severed both his arms and left the demon bleeding to death on the battlefield. With a cry of rage-filled agony, Shumba, who had just witnessed the fall of his brother, rushed toward the goddess, who stared him down with a steady gaze. As Shumba leapt from the back of his elephant carrier and soared through the air toward the goddess, she launched an arrow into the air from her bow and severed his head immediately. The goddess had defeated the 2 demons, Shumba and Shumba, who had given grief to the entire universe, which was her kingdom. For millenniums to come, legend would hold that after the great slaughter of the many demon kings, generals, and ministers, the goddess Kali, gorged on their blood and filled with the lust of war, began to move in a terrifying dance. The universe, unable to withstand the force of her unrelenting dance, began to break down, and try as they might, none of the devas were able to pacify her anger. So angry was she at the audacity of these demons who wanted to possess and obtain her as though she were no more than a figure to be traded and caged. She succumbed to the wild nature that flared up within her and pushed her toward the brink of insanity. She would not abide this injustice, and she would be captured by no one. Her form was a beautiful nightmare. Clothed in the remains of her enemies, she shrieked and danced, followed by witches and ghosts. Her necklaces of skulls shook on her chest, while her skirt, made entirely of the arms of fallen demon soldiers, flared out around her with a morbid grace that seemed to suck out the light from everywhere around her and draw it into her very being. The gods were terrified, and they went to the only person they thought might be able to help. The destruction of the universe was the duty of Lord Mahadev, Maheshwar himself, and they prayed to Lord Shiva to pacify the lethal goddess. Watching MahaKali's dance of destruction with a tranquility that belied the urgency of the situation, Lord Shiva agreed to calm the goddess and save the universe from her rage. As the goddess danced, her body smeared with blood and glowing with a dark effulgence, Lord Shiva laid himself down in her path. Only an act of complete surrender would calm the wild, primordial goddess who stomped on the earth again and again, her anger evident in every stark movement. She could not, would not be reasoned with. No show of possessiveness would work. But he could beseech her. Like a devoted worshipper at the altar of the divine goddess, he could prostrate himself before her and await her judgment. As she drew nearer, her dance became more intense. The wind rushed around them, and it seemed as though she would suck the life out of the entire universe. Her foot landed on his chest, and his smile was blissful. The goddess froze. Through the fog of bloodshed, a familiar calling pulled at her soul. It was as though the other half of her entire being called to her. The dense clouds of her anger dissipated, and she glanced down into the face of Lord Shiva, finally becoming conscious of all that she had done. Inexplicably drawn toward him, the goddess who had brought death to the demon hordes became shy and withdrawn. The Devas journeyed to the Vindhya mountains, where she continued to make her home, to celebrate the goddess who had manifested many diverse, fearful forms in order to save them. Rather than fearing her dark nature, they reveled in her mercy and worshipped her with gratitude and love, while they recited her many names with joy. The goddess, who was as kind as she was powerful, blessed them with a gentle and compassionate smile. This is the goddess who rules. This is the goddess of MahaKali. This is why she is often seen stepping upon the chest of Lord Shiva. And it is in that moment that she bares her tongue, in a moment thinking, what have I done? Her nature is twofold. She is as fearsome as she is compassionate. And she gains joy in willingly then coming under the control of Lord Shiva. In many, many, many different tellings, in many different versions of this pastime, the goddess Bhadrakali and Lord Shiva, Mahakal, have a dance-off. This is a goddess who will only accept her Lord as the one who can defeat her on the battlefield. And so on the battlefield, they dance. Finally, Lord Shiva does some things that the goddess will not do in dance. And she willingly submits to allowing him to be the Lord of her nature. I've always been enthralled with this story and lovingly enthralled by this goddess, because we all have an innate nature to not want to be controlled by anyone or anything. That is the nature that somehow caused us to create a rift between us and our Supreme Person, who was being adored and worshipped. He was the controller. And that nature within us said, no more. Why should you be the controller? Why should you be worshipped? I long to be worshipped. So now we are cast into this place where we try to make it as controllers. But it doesn't work out for us because we are not the internal nature. We are not the supreme potency of Sri Krishna. We are not that goddess Kali. But we do contain qualities of that nature. And in containing qualities of that nature, we can realize by this wonderful and glorious adventure that surrender can sometimes be the sweetest thing that we can do for our spiritual advancement, for our evolvement of our very nature. In surrendering to this sweetly fierce goddess, Lord Shiva gives himself over and says, fine, you are not to be controlled, but I can beg. I can pray. I can lay myself before you. This act of supreme vulnerability by Lord Shiva in so many ways throughout this pastime is glorious and wonderful. Lord Shiva is not possessed of an ego that says, I must subdue by force. He says, no. I bear all that I am before you. Do what you wish. And it is in that action that this goddess says, well, then I am yours. You've won. You've conquered my heart in the best of ways. So his surrender brings surrender. His act of surrender allows her then to surrender her fierce nature. So this is a very graphic, a very intense way of looking at the verse Trinadapi Sunichena. Looking at how being humble and tolerant, how offering all respect to others and expecting none in return for ourselves can bring about the greatest spiritual advancement. In Lord Shiva's act of surrender and giving all respect to this fearsome goddess, they then have a bond which is unshakable, a bond which is worshipped throughout all of creation. And so it is said that while Devi controls and creates this entire creation, it is under her control. There are a few realms outside of this material creation. Lord Shiva's eternal realm, MahaKalash, is outside of that realm. So in submitting himself to this great goddess, he transcends all of that. He transcends her veil of illusion, and then she decides to give him mastery over all of it. And so Lord Shiva is the greatest yogi, the greatest ascetic, the greatest meditator, the greatest Vaishnav, the greatest performer of devotional service. And as his consort, Devi is often protecting that devotional service at all costs. She is willing to protect the thing that her consort does the most. He sits in meditation on Lord Vasudeva, and she will protect those who meditate on Lord Vasudeva with everything within her power. Her power is unlimited and infallible. We can pray to this great goddess who can usher in auspiciousness. We can pray to surrender. Surrender like her own Lord. O Goddess, I submit myself at your feet. You have the power to subdue anything and everything. Then subdue my ego. Subdue that ego that tells me that I am supposed to win at the cost of others. Subdue that lust within my heart that only makes me see the worst. Subdue that tendency within my mind and within my heart to only think that the worst can happen. To think that I am not made for devotion. To think that somehow my Lord is against me. To think that somehow surrender is not the essence of my very existence and the purpose that I am meant for. Subdue my ego that tells me that I will not surrender, that I am not willing to be under the control of divine will, and usher in an auspicious new dawn where I recognize that my Supreme Lord is always on my side, where surrender is the sweetest goal, where devotion and divine will are always working for me. Usher in an existence filled with love of God. That is the goddess MahaKali. And this is what she can gift to us. There are many instances of her protecting devotees. So know that her protection is on your side. Her shelter is on your side. And while she is fierce and ferocious, terrific and awesome, she is death personified for the demons and for the demoniac tendencies within the heart. She is a wealth of auspiciousness and courage for the divine tendencies that live within the heart. I pray that she helps me cultivate those divine tendencies. I hope that she helps me on this path of devotion. She is so very dear to my Govinda, and so very dear to my own heart and my own advancement. Let us rise to the challenge of loving devotional service. Let us rise to the challenge of surrender. This is what is asked of us by this goddess. Will you serve? Will you rise to the challenge? Let us embrace our true natures as being servants of the divine Supreme Personality. Let that become our effulgence. Let that become the crest jewel of all of our qualities. Until next time, I pray that you all rise to the occasion. Rise and meet the challenge of this divine, beautiful goddess. Thank you so much for being with me on this exciting night. Tomorrow, we will speak about the goddess MahaKali. Tomorrow is going to be a night filled with romance and wonderful, wonderful talks of love and weddings. Tomorrow, the color is peacock green, representing desires and wishes that get fulfilled. So today was a green, which I have paired with black because really, I wanted to embrace that intensity of the goddess, and I love it. Tomorrow is a peacock green, that effulgent, iridescent green-blue that we see within peacocks, which is very, very mystical and ethereal. So tomorrow will be all about so many different wishes getting fulfilled. We'll talk about the goddess MahaKali, and we will talk about how a dream is a wish that your heart makes, and all of our goddess of happily ever afters and wonderful fairy tales. Until then, I wish you blissful times in your service, and I wish you a blissful and happy Navratri festival. Thank you again. Srila Prabhupada ki jai. Shri Shri Radha Govinda Dev ki jai. Ambe Mata ki jai. Vaishnav Sangha ki jai. I'll see you all again soon. Hare Krishna.